Good morning, church. How you guys doing today? It's a good day to be in God's house. Jesus is Lord, and it's a good day because of that. I want to read a story to you here from Mark chapter 4. And if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn there. It'll be on the screen as well, as always. So Mark chapter 4, we're going to be talking about Jesus and the storm. Mark 4:35 says this, "On that day when evening had come, Jesus told his disciples, 'Let's cross over to the other side of the sea.' So they left the crowd and took him along, since he was in the boat and other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and waves were breaking over the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. He was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion." That's my life verse right there. Jesus takes naps. Be blessed with that, saints. So they woke him up and said, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Silence, be still." The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified and asked one another, "Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." All right, so I don't know if you've ever had a moment, maybe out on a boat, on a kayak somewhere, where you had a little bit of a rough time on the water. Anybody? No? Okay, we're in Ohio, so everybody's like, "No, Joey, we don't go on the water." Anybody out? Okay, Dale, I saw that hand right there. Jacqueline, okay. Preachers love to say, "I see that hand." So let me tell you a story here real quick. One time we were on vacation with my family, and I don't remember how old I was, maybe 17 or so. And my family went somewhere on vacation. I forget even where it was. And they had a jet ski rental place. And we got a chance to go out. My mom's looking at me right now. She knows what's coming, okay? That's the downside to having your mom in the front row. And so we all kind of paired up on these jet skis. We went out onto the water. Me and my mom happened to pair up. My mom drove the jet ski for a little while. She did what she thought was ambitious. I was a little bit bored, to be honest, so we switched, and I started driving. And I had the brilliant idea of going as fast as I could and turning as hard as I could as many times as I could. So let's just say that it didn't take long for me to cut a turn pretty hard and both of us to end up in the water. Now, there's thankfully the kill switch that's attached to your wrist bracelet thing. So we're in the water. And now, before I tell you what happened next, you have to know that there were signs posted that said, "Watch out for manatees." Now, if you don't know how ferocious manatees are, let me tell you, they are the teddy bears of the sea. But we didn't know that. So we find ourselves flipped over a jet ski in the water. My mom is praying in English and tongues for the Lord to move in our midst. The jet ski is like off in the distance. She said, "Joey, there's manatees in the water." When I see the fear and anger in my mother's eyes, I begin to get afraid. Not because of manatees, but because I think she's going to kill me and make it look like a jet ski accident. And Dateline will never find out. The police will never find out. I'm pretty sure my life is over. But it turned out the manatees were cuddly, and they didn't hurt us, and we got on the jet ski, and I at least had a great time the rest of the time. And that's my story for you. The story that we're talking about today is a little more serious than that. So these guys here, they're in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus tells them, "Hey, let's go to the other side." So they're like, "All right, we follow Jesus. We do what he does. He says, let's go, we go." And what happens is Jesus decides to take a little bit of a sleep there. Jesus is fully God and yet fully man. He knows what it's like to be hungry, to be tired, all the things that come with human life in this world. So he's sleeping. And all of a sudden, a storm comes. And if you remember here, some of these guys, at least 4 out of Jesus' 12 disciples, were professional fishermen by trade. These guys know how to navigate a boat. And they find themselves in a situation that they are absolutely helpless. They find themselves in a position where they don't know what to do. The waves are crashing in. The wind is blowing. Their boat is filling up with water. And it seems like Jesus is not interested. And here's why this story, I think, carries so much power for our lives. Because I can list to you about 100 times that it felt like I was just doing my business, following Jesus, being the man he wanted me to be. I'm only in this boat because you told me to get in the boat. And now all of a sudden, I'm in a storm, and where are you, Jesus? I have a feeling I'm not the only one that's felt that way. Jesus, I'm only in this boat because you told me to get in the boat. I'm only here because you told me to get here. And what happens with the disciples is they say, don't you care that we're perishing? See, here's what we do. Well, let me put it this way. Here's what I do, okay? In the midst of me trying to do everything right, when stuff doesn't go my way, here's what I do. Oh, God must not be as good as I thought he was. Oh, God must not be as faithful as I thought he was. See, here's what we do. We let our circumstances define our view of God. And that if there's a storm, then all of a sudden Jesus must not care about us. Now, from our perspective, when you're reading the Gospels, you can imagine if you're one of these disciples, how ridiculous this is. This is a man that you believe to be the Messiah. He's healing the sick. He's raising the dead. He's multiplying food. He's announcing that God's kingdom has come. Except a storm came and took us all out, so there goes salvation. Like, it sounds ridiculous that Jesus didn't bring the disciples all that way just for a storm to take them out. And guess what? It's the same for your life. Jacqueline was talking about remembering the faithfulness of God, remembering the prayers that you prayed as a child, as a teenager, the prayers that you prayed last year, the things that you have, the prayers that have been answered. And what do? We get into a storm and it's like, well, God's never failed anybody in the history of the world, but maybe he's starting with Joey Jurgen right now. That's what we do. God's never failed anybody. He's never let anyone down. And all of a sudden, stuff begins to happen in our lives, and we think, well, it's all over now. It's just all downhill from here. Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? He doesn't care. How could he not do something about this? And I want to tell you today, friend, the storm has nothing to do with God's heart for you. If you base the love of God, the goodness of God, how God feels about you, based on the weather that's around you, your relationship with God will be up and down all the time. And I want to remind somebody today that even in the storm, he's good. Even in the storm, he's faithful. Even in the storm, he's worthy. And you see the fear that wants to come when the storm begins to come, when the wind begins to blow, when the waves begin to crash over the side of the ship, we begin to get this fear in our hearts. Why? We begin to fear that maybe God isn't who he said he was after all. And I need you to know this here. What Jesus does is he rebukes the disciples for their unbelief. Now that's hard. It's hard because it feels like fear is the only option when the storm comes. But I want you to know that what you fear is what you worship. And here's why. When you fear the storm, even though Jesus is in your boat, what you're really saying is that your destiny is in the storm's hands. When you begin to fear the storm, what you're saying is the storm has ultimate power over my story. The storm has ultimate power over my life. And so fear begins to creep in. And what fear is at its root is a failure of worship. We begin to exalt the storm above our Jesus. We begin to exalt the storm over our history with God. And all of a sudden, all those testimonies and miracles and all the things God did in the past, we forget about them in the storm. And we begin to see the storm as all-powerful and Jesus as checked out and disinterested. So what's the solution? The solution to fear is faith. Now, sometimes growing up in church, faith was sort of this thing that was like, if you're a good Christian, you'll just try really hard to believe, and boom, it'll just happen, and you'll be a super strong, faith-filled believer. And what I found in my life when storms come is I can't just try really hard to have faith. It just doesn't happen. The way you get faith is not by trying to muster up some sort of willpower. It's not by some generic optimism that I'm just a happy person. And faith is not burying your head in the sand and pretending like there's no storm. What faith is acknowledging that the one who's in the boat with you is Lord over the storm. That's where faith comes from. Let me give you an analogy here. Jason Walters. I've known this man for a number of years. If you were to ask me, Joey, do you trust Jason? Let me tell you something. If stuff happens in my life, I don't have to try really hard to trust Jason. I don't have to say, oh man, Joey, just trust him, just believe him. Just trust that he's going to do the right thing. You know why I trust him? Because I've seen and known him over the course of seasons of life, and I know the kind of man that he is. So when I know who he is, when he's proven his character, when he's proven his trustworthiness, I don't have to muster up faith or trust. I just trust him because he's Jason. In the same way, when you have a history with God and a connection to God, faith is not something you have to work up to be super spiritual. You don't have to work it up because I just got to try really hard to believe. If you just remember his faithfulness, faith will rise up all by itself inside of you. See, we treat faith like it's this spiritual discipline that we have to do. And I want to tell you, if you just stare at him long enough, you'll see faith rise in your heart. You see, it's when you realize that he's over the storm, that the storm ceases to be the thing that you feel governs you. It ceases to be the thing that you realize is in control, and it's not. You begin to see him for how beautiful he is. What I love about this story in particular is that these guys, they didn't even have faith. You know, there's stories in the New Testament where Jesus says to someone, the woman with the issue of blood presses through the crowd. Jesus says, daughter, your faith has saved you. How beautiful is that? There's another story where a guy is lowered through a hole in the roof, a paralytic man, and it says Jesus, seeing his friend's faith, healed him. So sometimes it's your faith, sometimes it's your friend's faith, and in this story, guess whose faith it was? Nobody's faith. That's how good God is. That sometimes you get to a moment in life where you don't have an ounce of faith. You're like, Jesus said I need a mustard seed. I don't even think I have that. And sometimes in the grace of God and the mercy of God, he calms your storm anyway. In the love of God, he shows up and he does what you couldn't even do. The ways that you and I say, God, where you at? God, don't you care? No faith in the world. And what does he do? He shows up in mercy and love. I was talking to Steve this week about a moment in his life where he was there in a hospital room with his wife who was in a coma. He said, Joey, I don't even think I was praying. I don't even think I had faith. And her body began to move. And she lived 17 more years. Sometimes we think that we have to be people of super faith. But sometimes it's not about how much faith you have, it's about who your faith is in. Timothy Keller says this. I want to read this quote to you. It's not the strength of your faith, but the object of your faith that actually saves you. Strong faith in a weak branch is fatally inferior to weak faith in a strong branch. That it's not about how much faith you have, but rather who your faith is in. And so Jesus, he gets up, He sees his disciples who should know better by now, but they don't. And he rebukes the storm anyway. And I love what this says here in Mark 4:41, the last verse that we read. It says, "They were filled with great fear and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Here's why I like this. They go from being scared of the storm to being scared of Jesus. Do you see that? It says they are filled with great fear. They're terrified. Imagine the only thing that's more terrifying than being out on a boat in the middle of the sea. You're a professional fisherman. The waves are breaking in. Your boat's filling up with water. You don't know what to do. The only thing more terrifying than that is a guy who controls the weather being in the boat with you. And here's what I want to remind you today to impart faith to you. I want to remind you who's in your boat with you. Church, when is the last time, think about this here, when is the last time you looked at Jesus the way these 12 guys looked at Jesus? When is the last time you were amazed by Jesus? When is the last time you were in awe of him? You see, what I've found in ministry and even in my own life is that more often than not, we as Christians are serving a God that we think is boring. No one will say that, but our lives speak louder than our words. I heard a pastor say one time, "God's not boring, you're boring." Be encouraged with that today, church. We pursue everything that this world has to offer, as if a job could make us happy, as if money could make us happy, as if a house or a car could make us happy. And I want to tell you something today. When is the last time you looked at him and said, "Who is this that's in my boat with me? Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey his name? Who is it that when he wakes up and he says the sea to be still, it becomes still?" Who's in your boat with you? Church, I want to tell you, when you invited Jesus Christ into your boat, you're inviting the one that the wind and the waves obey. You're inviting the one that raises the dead, that drives out demons, and is now seated at his Father's right hand as Lord over heaven and earth. He reigns, church. He reigns, and he's in your boat today. He's in your boat right now, and he's never not been in your boat with you. The storm comes and we forget our whole history with God. Well, he didn't do it the way I wanted. We just want a storm fixer. We just want someone to do what we want when we want it. Guess what? That's not God, that's a servant. We want a God to do what we want when we want, and guess what? He's not interested in what we want, and I wish it was the other way around. He's not. But he's Lord. And he's holy. And he's worthy. And I want to remind you today that he's in your boat with you. See, so often we just read these stories, and especially if you've heard them since you were little, like any of us who grew up in church, it's like, oh yeah, then there's the storm, and then he calms it, and just like you do when you get in a storm. And we lose the awe, we lose the wonder, we lose the majesty of all that Jesus has done in history and in our lives. We take our eyes off him and onto the storm. When is the last time you were amazed by him? When's the last time you looked at him and said, "Who are you that the wind and the waves obey you? Who is this man who's holy, who's worthy?" I want to remind you, church, of the power of our Christ, of the beauty of our Christ. We go through life and we're busy and life is full of stuff to do. And if we're not careful, life with God just becomes 90 minutes on a Sunday morning as part of your calendar. If you're not careful, life with God becomes just a moral program of good things you should do and bad things you shouldn't do. If you're not careful, life with God just becomes a few concepts in your head. And all of that is part of it. There's ways to think, there's things to do, there's times that we should gather together. I believe in all of that. But more than anything, you are inviting a person into your boat with you. And that person is more amazing than you realize. That we become so casual in the presence of God. You know, we're pretty casual here at City Alive. You don't see me wearing a suit, thank God. We're not up here with stained glass windows and singing hymns and all that stuff. And, you know, churches do that, and that's great. It's not really our style. The problem is what happens in a setting like that is because the atmosphere is casual, we let our hearts become casual to the presence of God. This is what the Lord's Prayer is all about. Hallowed be your name. What does that mean? It means, God, let your name be holy. Let it be holy. Now, we're not making God more holy than he is, but we're making him holy in here. That he's not casual to me. He's not ordinary to me. He's not just another thing on my schedule. He's not just another action that I have to do. He's Jesus of Nazareth, and he's in my boat with me, and he invites me to a living, breathing relationship. He's in your boat. I want to close here by pointing a few things out to you. In the scriptures, the sea, more often than not, represents chaos and darkness and death. We see this in the Old Testament a lot. Starting in Genesis chapter 1, it says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the what? The waters. And then out of that dark and empty void, God brings a new life and a new world. In the story of Noah, the flood waters come, wiping out all of the evil and injustice, and God brings Noah and his family safely out of the waters again. Story of Exodus, children of Israel in bondage in Egypt. They come out from Pharaoh's power. Pharaoh's behind them, and they're on the run, and they get to the Red Sea. And what happens? Through Moses, God parts the Red Sea, and they come up out of the waters into freedom. When Israel crosses into the Promised Land, for Joshua, parts the Jordan River. They walk in to the freedom God had for them. Jonah, in the belly of the beast, 3 days and 3 nights, says, the waters of death surrounded me. And so you can imagine for ancient people going out on a wooden boat in the sea, it feels unsafe, right? It's not tame. And so throughout the Old Testament, from Genesis 1, Noah, Moses, Jonah, all the way through, the sea and the waters represent chaos, represent death, represent the forces of this world that are not controlled. And what Psalm 107 says, it's not on the screen, says, then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. You see, what the Psalms and what the whole Bible represent is that in the midst of the chaos of life, in the midst of the storms of life, in the midst of the untamable things of life, there's a God who's sovereign over the waters. There's a God who's sovereign over the storm. There's a God who's sovereign over the wind and the waves. And so when Jesus comes and he gets baptized, this is part of what baptism represents. It's a going down into the waters of death and coming out again into new life. And so when Jesus here, when he calms the storm for the disciples, it explicitly says that he rebuked the wind and the waves. That word rebuke is the same word where Jesus rebukes demons. That this isn't just weather that's happening, but Jesus is actually Lord over the storms of life. He's Lord over the powers of darkness. He's Lord over the forces of chaos that threaten to destroy the abundant life that God has for us. And what we see in Revelation here, Revelation chapter 4, there's a picture of God's throne. It says that before God's throne, there's flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder that come from the throne. 7 fiery torches were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Now look at this here in verse 6. Something like a sea of glass, similar to crystal, was also before the throne. Before God's throne in heaven, there's a sea. But the thing about this sea is that it's as still as glass. See, before God's throne in heaven, there's no wind that's threatening to blow him off his throne. There's no wave that's threatening to tip him over. There's no storm that's coming to dethrone the King of Kings. But before our King, he reigns over all things, and the storm and the waves and the sea are always still. The sea is always still in his presence. Final verse, Revelation 21. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I want you to see that here. Now, I don't think this means that literally there's no sea in the new creation God wants to make. But that as a prophetic image, the sea, which has represented chaos and death and the powers of darkness, God says a day is coming when the sea's no more. A day is coming when the storms are no more. A day is coming when the waves and the wind are no more, because our King will triumph over every storm. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away." Church, I know life in this world, it just feels like a giant storm all the time. And when you get through one storm, it seems like another storm comes. You get through a financial storm, then you got a health storm. And you deal with the health storm, then you got a family storm. And it feels like storms are just the default in life in this world. But I want to remind you who's in your boat with you today. And I want to remind you that a day is coming when all storms are wiped away. There's no death, no sorrow, no crying, no pain, because those are former things that will have passed away. He's the one that the wind and the waves obey. And whatever you're going through today, I want you to know that he's good, and he's faithful, and he's holy, and he's worthy, and he's beautiful, and he's good, and he's kind, and he's wise, and he's strong. And the waves will always be under his feet.